Thanks for having me here. I'm sorry with the issues with my camera, and I was late, so there was not really the time to fix it. So I have a presentation. I have some questions to you, but if you have questions, feature. The work I'm going to present is research I conducted together with former PhD students, including Oksana Kulik, who is now at the IT University in Copenhagen, and Karen Renaud, who is a well-known usable security researcher from Scotland. I will briefly talk about end-to-end verifiable electronic voting. I am pretty sure you have heard a lot about it, but I try to talk more from a user's perspective about end-to-end verifiable systems. Then I will talk about results from our own usable security research. There's other research, for instance, from the group of Peter Ryan in Luxembourg, but the focus of this talk today is about our own usable security research. And at the end, there are some open research questions and directions that we are going to discuss afterwards. Before I start, some remarks. First of all, I talk about secret elections, polls, and referenda. So I don't make a difference for this talk whether we talk about elections, polls, and referenda, but what is important, all should be secret. The focus will be on remote voting, also called online or internet voting. However, I'm not talking about coercion, so you may, for the rest of the talk, just assume that online voting is considered to be an additional channel on top of postal voting. And as we all know, when we talk about postal voting, there is also some problems with coercion, but for this talk, I'm not talking about coercion or even ideally coercion resistance. I will also not focus on authentication. I simply assume that there is a, let's say, secure postal channel to distribute voting credentials, or that voters, like in Estonia, already have an ID card, an electronic one, that they can use to authenticate to the system. Okay, as I have said, I would like to look at end-to-end verifiable voting systems from a user's perspective. So if it comes to the user, they nowadays use a lot of digital services, and I just have one example here, online shopping. So how does it work for most of the users, for most of the services? Again, okay, maybe this is different in Estonia because they have this e-ID, but for all the other countries that don't have an electronic ID distributed as it is distributed in used in Estonia, it works like this. People have a username and a password which they use to log in to their shopping page. They make a product selection. Usually they are asked to confirm whether they are sure that they really want to buy this product. Then there is a thank you page, and ideally at some point the product arrives. So from a user's point of view, not being a security expert, not being an election expert, you may assume that online voting works simply the same. The only difference is that, in particular, if you vote for the first time, you don't have a username and a password. So you may assume, okay, like with banks, there is a pre-step where you receive an envelope, including your username and your password. Again, you use it to go to the online voting web page. You select your candidate, you confirm your selection, and then the web page says, thank you. And after some time, when the voting period is over, you have the result being published. It's very likely that this is the first thing that voters would expect if you talk with them about online voting. Now, the problem is, and I think I'm not telling you new stuff here, is that if we have a attacker in place, be it the voting service provider itself or be it a cyber attacker. Now, if you look again to online shopping, of course, the online shopping service will try whatever is possible to protect the service and your data. The good thing, and maybe I should say this, I mean, we all see the media reports and can easily see that actually nothing is 100% secure or even close to 100% secure, but data is leaked, systems are hacked, and so on. The good thing for the user when it comes to online shopping is that he or she can actually at least detect that something is going wrong if integrity is violated. The product may not arrive. He or she is asked to pay stuff that he never ordered. So at least he notices, he can complain, and hopefully he gets the money back. And what voters need to understand, and also the election management boards that decide about online voting, is that this is different if it comes to online voting. Because if you use the system as I describe it on the right side, then there is a result published, yes, but from the result, as long as your candidate gets at least one vote, you will not be able to distinguish an election in which an attack took place and an election in which you can trust the election result. And that's a big problem. So there's one remark I would like to make here. So, yes, this is the case for many online shopping applications, but at least those people who are interested in security, I mean, not from a research point of view, but who care about their cybersecurity, they may have started using two-factor authentication, even it's only optional. But it's also worth mentioning that most, even if they are not caring that much about their cybersecurity, that they actually get sometimes a more secure, a more difficult approach. And that's when it comes to banking, because banking usually is not that straightforward as you can see it on the slide, but there is something else, you can call it, to verify for the users. And that's maybe something that can help voters that are not security experts to get an understanding or feeling of the importance of verifiability, or an idea why you should do more than what you can see on the right side if it comes to online voting. Okay, so this I think is something I can skip, that we should distinguish between the cyber criminals that may hack devices, network, but also the server side, and it could be external or internal. I think you have heard that end-to-end verifiability has two parts, individual verifiability and universal verifiability, and that there are many cryptographic protocols that try to solve the trade-off between a system being end-to-end verifiable and protecting vote secrecy. So for our research on usable security, it is important to understand what has to be usable, because it's a voter. So the one that is not a security expert or an election expert has to be conducted. And actually, if you look into individual and universal verifiability, yes, voters can conduct universal verifiability, but they don't have to, because you can ask experts or trusted institutions like the OSCE. However, there's one step at least, which is cast as intended, one step of the individual verifiability, which the voter has to conduct, because otherwise vote secrecy would be broken. I would first of all like to give you an idea of what type of approaches actually exist. And I try to categorize them from a voter's point of view, so not from a security point of view, like how much end-to-end verifiability do you get, but from a point of view that what are the steps the voter has to take and when he needs to take these steps. There are those steps that I call on top and mainly after approaches. What I mean by it is that as a voter, you can actually cast your vote without any additional actions needed to take to verify. So you can just cast your vote, and if you want to verify, you can do it, but you don't have to in order to cast your vote. And mainly after means like there's even nothing to do maybe during the vote casting, but there is only something to be done after you have cast your vote. And one well-known representative of this is the Estonian approach. Then the second category are those on top, but during and after approach. And the most well-known approach here is the Helios voting system. So here the voter actually needs to do something. He or she can still cast his vote without doing any steps on verifying. So you could just cast your vote and just trust the system and be happy about the result. But if you want to verify, there's on the one hand something you should do during vote casting, and I will come back to this later on. Ideally, you do it more than once. This is for cast as intended, and if you want to go for stored as cast, you also need to verify afterwards, like after you have cast your vote. The third approach I want to mention is the integrated approach. The integrated approach is different from the two before. So if I go back, so you can see both of these approaches use a second device to verify. For the integrated approach, you don't have necessarily a second device. However, there's something special about it, because before you cast your vote or can cast your vote as a voter, you will receive a code sheet which at least contains something called return code and a confirmation code. And the idea is that once you have entered or made your choice for, in this case, we have options to have it simpler on the slide. So I would go for yes. Then in step 3, I would get from the system a return code back, and my task is to check the return code. And if I'm happy because it matches the selection I made, then I'm asked to enter the confirmation code. So you can see this is more integrated. I mean, of course, you could argue the return code is displayed and it's not necessary to check the return code. As a voter, I could immediately confirm. However, compared to what people know from e-banking, this seems to be more close to what they know. And before we come to some user studies, I think from what I explained to you at the beginning on shopping and banking, you may already guess that such approach is much easier to sell to voters because it's much closer to what they know already. Okay, so let's talk about usability in the voting context. If we talk about usability, we usually have 3 different criteria. We have efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. I would like to go through them with you to give you an idea how important each of the 3 is in the voting context. So let's start with efficiency. As a usable security researcher, usually this is a very important one for our research, because voting is very special. So the things we do on usable security are more on authentication, on, let's say, phishing detection. So, and these are things that users do very often. So if I want to log into my computer, to my smartphone, I don't want it to take 10 seconds. I probably even don't want it that it takes 5 seconds. It's the same if I check emails, whether they are a phish or not. I don't want to spend 10 seconds or even 5 seconds on each email, and I actually don't have the time to do this. So efficiency is very important when it comes to security mechanisms that we use on a daily basis, and even more often at one day. But we don't talk about such an application. So if we talk about voting, again, it depends on from country to country. So I guess we all agree that in Switzerland, we have a country where you are asked to cast a vote more frequently than in other countries. But even in Switzerland, maybe you are asked to cast a vote once a month. I think that's already a lot. So if you do something every only once a month, I think there's no issue in spending 10 minutes or even, 10 seconds, a minute, maybe even 10 minutes to cast your vote. Because you actually, in terms of usability, you may want to compare it to postal voting. So postal voting means you fill it out on paper, which is usually quite fast, but then you have to go to a post box in order to have it sent to the central service. So this also takes some time. So in summary, yes, it should not take ages or hours, but efficiency is not as important as it is in other security applications. The next one is effectiveness. What is important to mention here is that you should be able, so voters should be able to do two things. They should be able to cast their vote, and they should be able to verify. So how do you know that they are able to verify? The only way to study this in a user study is to actually integrate or to manipulate the system, but not telling your participants beforehand. I will talk about these type of user studies later on. We call them deceptive user studies because you're not telling your participants what your actual goal is, but you may tell them it's like general usability considerations of a voting system. And then what you want to know is whether they are able to detect that the system is manipulated, meaning in particular, because we talk about cast as intended, that it changes the vote before sending it to the server. Now, the last one is satisfaction. Again, we argue that satisfaction is not as important as in other contexts. For the same reason, first of all, because we don't do it on a daily basis. So even if there are some cumbersome steps in it, we only cast a vote once a month or even once a year. This one we actually studied in a user study some years ago, where we gave participants 3 different systems, starting off with one of these black box systems, so similar to the one you have seen on the one of the very first slides. And we gave them 2 more where they had to do additional steps for security reasons. And we actually told them that they have to take these additional steps for security reasons. And all the participants agreed that it's okay to take additional steps if it is needed to get an adequate level of security. So that's why we usually actually measure satisfaction, but our focus is on effectiveness, because if your voters are not able to cast your vote, you obviously have a problem. But from our point of view, if voters are not able to verify and are not able to detect manipulations, we have a much bigger problem. Okay, so in the last couple of years, we actually mainly studied two approaches. One is the Helios approach, and the other one is the return code one that is used by the Swiss Post. So I'm going to give you an overview and an idea of things that you should consider when running user studies in this context. So starting off with Helios, there are Canadian researchers, Weber and Hengartner, that started the original interfaces in 2009 from Helios. And unfortunately, at this point in time, only 10% were able to verify. Definitely, it's worth mentioning that also the Helios people improved their interfaces. So even if one would now study the most recent interfaces, these numbers would be higher, but some years ago, I think having seen these results, there was a clear motivation to study these interfaces, but also this general idea of the Benelux challenge to enable people to verify. So what we did, first of all, is something we call cognitive walkthrough. And we did so in order to identify steps in the original interface in which people were likely to make mistakes, in particular if they are not security or election experts. In order to conduct such a cognitive walkthrough, we had meetings with different types of experts. So there were purely usability experts involved. So again, they don't have an idea of security, verifiability, and so on. There were people involved organizing elections, security people, but also kind of lay people, so those that are supposed to use the voting system later on. And based on these findings, we came up with our own improvement, and the improvement itself was further iterated through user feedback. So far, I mentioned that Helios is based on the Benelux challenge. I don't know whether everyone is familiar with it, but I'm going to explain it now by showing you the first improvements we did 10 years ago on the Helios interface. So assuming that you have already logged into the system, you have made your selection, and what has happened now, before you see the screen that is on my slide, is that Helios has encrypted your selection and commits kind of to this encryption, and in particular the randomness used to encrypt this your vote by showing something that we call it check code, but which is kind of a hash value. So here you can already see from the interface that you could just cast your vote, and you could simply ignore the check code and not verify anything. So let's assume we are interested in checking whether the software behaves properly and actually encrypted the candidate we selected. So we would click on start checking. in order to check, you get a lot of information, including the candidate that was selected and including the randomness used to encrypt your vote. In our interface, you can select one of these two trustworthy institutes to perform the actual verification. So whether the vote you selected is cast as intended. In order to do so, you would click on choose for checking. Let's say we select the BSI, and you would enter, actually a new web page would open. You would reach a web page from the BSI. You are asked to copy the information you have received from the Helios voting system into this box, and then click checking. And once you have checked, click checking, you would get a new page, and you see additional information below the checking button, which is on the one hand the hash value and the candidate you selected. So the voter's task to verify is now on the one hand to compare whether this hash value is equal to the hash value that was shown on the very first screen, and whether they actually went for the private party. And now it gets, and we will see this in the user study later on, a little bit tricky, because, okay, I'm convinced this vote was cast, was encrypted properly. However, the randomness is revealed, so I cannot cast this vote because otherwise secrecy would be violated. So what voters need to do is they click on back to voting. Depending on the instantiation, you would go back to an empty ballot, make your selection. It's encrypted again using a different randomness. And again, you can check, decide whether you want to check or cast your vote. And the idea behind is that the voting system never knows whether you cast your vote because you're already convinced, or whether you decide to click on start checking, so you verify again. Okay, having made these improvements, we're interested, first of all, whether people are kind of motivated to verify, and we did an evaluation in the lab. So when you conduct a user study in the context of electronic voting, most likely you will find so-called roll cards. So besides the typical informed consent that people sign before the actual study starts, you show them or hand over a roll card in which you describe, okay, assume you are person A, you like party B, and in the following user study, please go for party B. And the reason why you do this is to protect vote secrecy. So you may do screen recording, you may have people complaining, and if you wouldn't do it, it's very likely that you would learn their favorite party or candidate or option, and that's what you need to avoid, and that's why you give roll cards. So what we did in this first study is we actually, in order to see whether people would verify, we on the one hand ask them questions afterwards, but we also used eye tracking. So we could see where people were looking. from the statements people made, whether they think they verified, actually 82% stated that they verified their vote before casting it. From looking at the eye tracking data, you could see that only 59% actually clicked on this one button. Furthermore, thanks to eye tracking, we could see that people went through the process, but if it comes to the hash value that needs to be compared, only very rarely people checked character by character. So they looked once or twice from one to the other, but we are not very convinced that they would have detected a manipulation, being that the hash value is a different one. Furthermore, as I explained before, it is crucial that people verify more than once. Out of the 20 that verified it all, there were 8 that verified more than once. So what can we learn from it? So besides that, it's important to use a roll card to protect vote secrecy. It's also important to use either eye tracking or at least screen recording to understand or to get kind of a proof what people actually did, because just asking them, they may just state that they verified, although they did not. Eye tracking is kind of cumbersome because you need more time to calibrate the devices. So later on, we actually also used only screen recording. However, it's worth mentioning, in particular for a system like Helios, you get better results if you use eye tracking. You may think that these numbers are not as bad, in particular if you compare it with the 10% from the Canadian researchers. However, like with all user studies, also this user study has a limitation, has a lot of limitations, but at least one is relevant. That is that half of the participants had a technical background. So it was not like security or election experts, but they had a technical background, and I think they were more likely to play around with the interface than maybe non-technical people. So the question we ask ourselves afterwards is there actually a lack of motivation to verify? You may argue that yes, not that many people verified, but it was only a user study and we told them what to vote for. So maybe it was not that important for them whether the vote was manipulated or not. But that may be different if it comes to actual elections where they are real voters. So we looked into paper-based elections to see what type of verifiability exists there. On the one hand, so it's if you look to these pictures, this would be someone, the one wearing the black clothes is verifying or observing the election in Germany. I know again that not everything is possible in other countries, but in Germany, you can stay there the entire day. You can see that the ballot box is empty, that voters' right to vote are checked properly, that like goes all the day through the day, and then at the end of the day, you can observe that all votes are properly tallied. So there's a lot you can do, and there's a lot people could, at least in Germany, know of what you can verify. But what is important to notice here is that the first step, cast as intended, does not exist in the paper-based system, because you get your piece of paper and a pen, you make a cross for one candidate, you put it into the ballot box, and there's no way for someone to, in this polling station election to change. So it's really you putting it into the ballot box, and there's no need for casters intended verifiability. However, I explained earlier that this is actually the most crucial step for the user because it's only the user who can do this. So it's not I can ask someone else to do this step for me, but it's a voter. And having said this, I think you can see that it might be challenging to motivate people to take a step for casters intended verifiability, as it's something they don't know of. We try to understand better what they know about these observations. So we ask them how they can tell that the individual postal vote or vote in the polling station was not modified or removed. So we had a lot of these research questions, and it turned out that the most common mental model is trust in people and processes. So only very rarely all the others were mentioned. So even this study was conducted in Germany, where we have this possibility to verify. People say, okay, they simply trust in people and processes. And then there were some that mentioned something like, okay, there are observers around. They simply have no clue. They think that there are some checks, like does the amount of voters matches the amount of ballots, the ballot box is sealed, and so on. And what we also learned is that the term verify or verifizieren in German is not used at all by our users. They used different terms. And that's also why we are not going to use the term verify on our interface, but we talk about, for instance, checking something. So having conducted this one, we concluded that we think it's important to put effort in awareness for verifiability because it's in particular casters intended, nothing that is given in the paper-based elections, and we recommend to use our results on mental models and terminology to talk to voters. We further on had an idea how we can further simplify the Helios approach using QR codes and a mobile device. The idea is that you have a second device, mainly your mobile device, and instead of comparing the hash value manually, the app can do this for you because you first scan the hash value by scanning a QR code. That's what you can see on this slide. If you want to check, you get all the information again provided in a second QR code. You scan this QR code as well, and only if the hash values matches, you would get the party you selected displayed on last screen. So if you really selected the pirates, then you're fine, and you can see that this time at least the software encrypted the proper vote, and you can decide next time again whether you want to verify again or whether you trust and cast your vote. Now I have a first question to you. By making this proposal, we also improved slightly the security. Anyone has an idea why this is slightly better from a security point of view than the original version with the two web pages?
Machine verifies hashes, not the human.
Yes, so it becomes more usable. Yes, and this also makes it more secure. That's correct. And purely from a security point of view.
Maybe because there is not the two hash values to compare.
Yes, so that's what Alo just said, that you don't need to compare it because it's done automatically by the app. Anyone else can see something else?
Maybe you don't have to go away from the initial page.
Yes, that also makes it more usable. Anything else?
Maybe because your privacy has not been leaked to someone else, because you're using your own app.
That's an interesting point, and we come to this vote secrecy aspect in a minute. That's true. I'm not telling here who is the owner of the app, whether it's the voters app or whether the app actually comes from the OSCE or the BSI. But yes, if it's my own one, you're right. Anything else?
The number there, they can check the number, the code.
So actually, it's interesting that you all mention a lot of usability related issues. So I thought it's worth mentioning that the original one is just operating on one device. So if the device itself is manipulated, then it would just manipulate both the vote casting and the verifying, and you will not notice it. And here it's slightly better because you have two different devices. So assuming that they are really independent, I know that is something that people are not all agreeing on, but assuming they are kind of independent, then even if you have some malware on your one device, for instance, your Windows machine that you use to cast your vote, but not on your iPhone, then you actually also have improved the security taking this approach, although our main idea was to make it simpler for the user. And as you already commented in, I think, without even running a user study, you can see that this looks like it gets simpler and thus less error prone for users. Okay, let's continue. We conducted a usability evaluation in the lab, and we were interested to see whether the second improvement actually performs better than the first improvement. We gave them a roll card with two instructions. So one is what they should vote for, as I explained before. And secondly, we actually instruct participants to verify, which is kind of the equivalent for making them aware that verifying is important. So we simply told them, please verify. Or actually, I mean, on the slide, I say verify, but in the instructions, we said, please check. So coming to the results, this time we didn't have half of the participants being, having a technical background, but still the numbers of those based on the screen recording that at least went through all the steps to verify is similar to before, being 61%, and with the improvement, 81%. So 20% more participants actually went through all the steps. So now you may wonder, why not 100%? And so I wanted to go back. So first of all, to explain you where they stopped. Those who did not verify from the screen recording, we could see that they so they did this one, and then they went to ballot checking, but then they clicked on back to voting without having checked this, scanned this QR code. So they kind of were following our tasks that they should check. So they clicked on start checking, but then they immediately went back to voting. So, and that's why I showed you these two screens here. So also from the follow-up interviews with those that did not verify properly, we could see that on the left side, this is the improvement 1 interface, the back to voting button was perceived more prominent. So having seen all this numbers, and it was much more highlighted for them back to voting than choose for checking. So that's why we think more people went here back to voting compared to the one on the right side, where they saw the second QR code plus. Let me go once more back. Actually, if you have clicked on scan check code, so on this one, so you have checked it, you immediately went on your screen to the second screen on your app, which already told you scan ballot code. So there were 2 hints that you should do something more. However, there were only 81%, so it looks like there is room for improvements, because ideally, in particular, if you ask them to verify, everyone should be able to verify. Just to give you an idea about efficiency and satisfaction, although as I explained, I don't think it's that important. We measured how long it takes them to verify. So for those that actually verified properly, you have almost 2 minutes versus a little bit more than 2 minutes and 1 minute. And I think from what I have explained to you beforehand, this is all no problem. Even 2 minutes to verify shouldn't be an issue. Satisfaction, there's a scale from 1 to 100, the system usability scale, SUS, and the systems actually reached quite similar values, which are not very good because the scale goes to 100. But giving the explanation at the beginning, I think these are more than enough. And now I also want to mention this, and I think one of you mentioned it beforehand already, that from the qualitative, so the open text, no, actually, I'm not sure it was open text, or maybe it was an interview. But from what they said, they were scared about vote secrecy, and actually this holds for both. So the fact that either on the app or on a web page, they saw their candidate, they were scared about it, and they didn't want to use such a system for real elections. And the problem is that they were not aware that they could verify any vote, and then only once they have decided to trust, they could go for the candidates they actually want to vote for. So we did not explain it to them, but it was not like seen by any of our participants that that would be an approach to solve the issue with vote secrecy. So that's definitely, in terms of trust, something that should be addressed, because if people are scared because they don't understand the mechanism or they don't use it properly, it will not end in election or election result people have trusted. One limitation I want to mention here is, as I said, we ask them to verify, and actually all of our participants from the screen recording, we could see that they only verified once. And that's maybe the difference to the paper I presented before, where we had a lot of technical people involved, because the technical people were more like clicking around in the interface and trying things out, which was not the case for these lay people. Okay. Now we wanted to understand whether at least those people that go through all the steps are able to detect manipulations. As I explained you before, what we need to do here is to run a deceptive user study, meaning we tell them it's about the usability of a voting system, but we manipulate the voting system in a way that the caster's intended verifiability will fail. And the question is whether they detect it. And independent from whether they detect it or not, we have to debrief them. So we have to tell them afterwards what our main goal was and why we could not tell him in advance. And at this point in time, they can still decide whether we can use their data or whether we should withdraw their data because they don't want to be part of the study anymore. Any ideas from your side on what type of manipulations I could introduce in the last improvement? So having the QR codes being shown and then the app in place. So what manipulations would you have studied in a lab study to see whether people would detect it?
Yeah, one idea was that maybe to include some gibberish in the QR code so that it actually is not possible to scan it or not possible to, that it doesn't include any valid data, maybe, and see if this is detected or reported.
That could be one approach. So what would be the goal of the attacker in this manipulation?
No, the attacker would manipulate, but effectively there will be no chance to verify the vote. And maybe users would think that this is just a random bug, would try to recast the vote, and this time it wouldn't be manipulated.
Okay, so
this would work for those who do not, who let's say, this would work probably for those who do not verify, right? These votes could be stolen in this case.
But so just to summarize, so your idea would be to encrypt a different vote, and but including rubbish into the QR code, so that if you use the app, it would just say
it wouldn't work. Failure or
failure.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, because this is a very similar case we had in Estonia, where it was not the case that it shows wrong selection, but it says simply failure to error, failure to. So that's a bit different error message, but also could have been the caused by an attacker, right? So that's also to think for.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone has a different idea for a different attack?
They can attack social trust and like by the rejecting the verification, they can stop the system working, and yeah, it's kind of denial of service.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't think I get the question actually. Do you want us to think about an attack to break consent verification, or do you want to think of a way to design a study to see how the users will behave?
So I want to study whether they manipulate, they detect a manipulation, but I haven't decided which manipulations. I mean, of course, we decided 2 years ago which we study, but I just wanted to know what type of manipulations you would have studied. So I think there are several ways. So we already learned you just put rubbish into a QR code. And I think there are many things you can do if you are the attacker and you can control the interfaces of the main voting system. So what would you like to change? And then measure whether people would detect it.
The tally, the result of the voting system, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, ideally, you would like to make a manipulation that has an effect. And I think even the effect can be different, so that you just want to cause distrust. You want to actually change the outcome by changing the vote, or by making the voter not to submit a vote at all because he's so confused. So there are different motivations for the attacker and different ways to implement manipulations if you have control over the voting system.
What about simply not showing the QR code, or showing alternative instructions saying, "Oh no, your vote is we already verified. Don't worry." Yeah.
Yes, very good. Okay, so we were thinking of which manipulations to study, and we thought there are at least 3 dimensions to think of. So one is the type of attack, and actually I learned today that there's a third one, but we only thought there's either I want to change the vote or make the voter not submitting anything, but thinking a vote has been submitted. The second dimension is is it hard or easy to detect? And easy to detect is most likely for the candidate has changed. So you go through everything and it doesn't say pirate, but another party. And so that would be easy to detect. But then there are more difficult to detect ones. For instance, using social engineering techniques. That's related to what Jordi just said. That you either remove the checking button completely. That's maybe in between easy and difficult. But then you may also give instructions saying, "Oh, thanks, we verified, everything is fine. Thanks for your vote for the pirates, and you can close the window." And the third dimension is whether you give them additional information about the system and the security features, or you don't give them. As it was the first time that we studied something like this in a deceptive user study on electronic voting, we thought, let's start to have it easy. Most likely attackers want to change things, but make it easy for the voter. So that's why it's highlighted, easy to detect, and we did not give voters additional information. So we tried to find a balance between, on the one hand, easy to detect, but on the other hand, without additional information. And you can already see that if you want to do this kind of properly before you conduct real elections, there's a lot to do, because there is more than just one manipulation that should be studied in such a user study. However, I mean, we only studied one. They got, again, the roll card. It was, for us, the case that 77% detect the manipulation, and the manipulation was that people were asked to go for, I don't remember the name, but one party, and then the display was the pirates. And the question kind of was, first of all, did they go through all the steps? And then did they detect and complained about the output of pirates and not the parties they selected? The numbers mean the following. Either people did not go through the entire process, so there was the same problem as reported in our Kai paper, that people stopped too early, but for those that went through all the steps, they complained to us that the output is not correct. I mean, they were not talking about a manipulation. They just said there's a problem with the system. It does not work properly. And then we debriefed them and told them what it is about. We are still with Helios, so ideally you should verify more than once. Again, in the study, all the 31 participants only verified once and did not verify more than one. So if you want to use a system like this, I would recommend to also try to explain more the insights of the Bannerload challenge in terms of that it's good to verify more than once, or at least that the system should not know how often you verify. There are obviously remaining challenges for users. There is an ongoing discussion, and I would like to come back to this in the discussion section with you, that some people, I think, would argue that it's enough that verifiability is available, but it's not necessarily that everyone is able to understand it and go through the steps. And I'm happy later on to get your opinion on it. Now I actually have a question to the organizers about the time that I have, because I have some more insights from studying the Swiss Post interfaces, but I don't know how much time we have and how much time I should leave for the discussion.
We have, I think, 5 more minutes. We can go on.
Okay, then
yeah.
Okay, so let's see whether we, what in summary. So we, what I explained you so far is our research on the Helios voting system. I don't really can explain why, but we stopped at some point and started, or actually I probably have a reason, but started studying this more integrated approach. The reason is we kind of also evaluated the same change in a deceptive user study with this interface. So in this case, I should not only say interface, but it's also the code sheet that you get. So what we did here was we changed the return code. So the candidate were asked to click, the participants were asked to click on yes, but they received D45R back. And the question was, do they detect it or do they just continue with the confirmation code? And I think that was the reason why we continued from this point in time on with the Swiss Post interfaces and code sheet, because this time we had 100% that detected it compared with the 77% with Helios. There's on the right side just some parts of the code sheet used by the Swiss Post at this point in time. And from while these are good results, 100%, you may remember that it was, first of all, an easy to detect manipulation. And from the feedback we got and from doing a lot of usability research, we could see easily a number of shortcomings. So the main shortcoming is this one, that if you, like with the process on the left side, this is the original one, is like, okay, there's something related to check code, and then I should enter a confirmation code. And if people don't read this properly, they may just think, I don't know, if the interface says what Jordi said before, your check code is okay, please enter your confirmation code, giving the original code sheet, it's very likely that they just enter the confirmation code and don't go down and check for their party that they were supposed to vote for and check the check code, so what is called return code in some previous slides. So what we did is we improved this polling sheet to a more step-by-step approach. We told them that they should call the support. We have kind of these ifs and else cases. So if there's a problem, call the support. And you can even tick the boxes so to make sure you got all the steps, which we thought makes it less likely for more difficult to detect manipulations. We actually studied it from a usability point of view, but I'm skipping this. And I only want to mention that this time we studied in the deceptive user study, where we wanted to see whether they detect manipulations, actually 2 different manipulations. On the one hand, the easy to detect one with the wrong return code, and a more difficult to detect one, which you can see on the right side. It is just asking for a confirmation code and not displaying any return code. We just come to the results. For the easy to detect one, with the original one, this time we had not 100% detection rate, but with our improvement we had. However, and I think that's alarming, if you go to the more difficult one, with the original one, only 9% of the participants detected it. And even with our improvements, 44% only detected it. And again, from the interviews we conducted afterwards, we learned that some of those that detected it would have called the number from the web page. So on the web page, we also had on each web page a telephone number one could call. And so kind of, yes, they noticed it, but they didn't really get it entirely because they would have called the web page. The number from the web page. So what we haven't done is to give them additional information about the security features of these systems, and that's ongoing work that we want to study this further. I'm skipping this one, and I come to my summary and then to the discussion. So end-to-end verifiability is important, but also important for users to understand. There are many different approaches, and they are different not only from a security perspective, but also from the user involvement. So how much users need to be motivated, how much they need to do, whether it's integrated or afterwards. I talked about some contributions we did. And although this was very short at the end, the integrated approach for casters intended verifiability is most promising, which is kind of also maybe not too surprising. Some open research directions questions that I see. On the one hand, there's no or only less research on visually impaired voters, but also they should be able to verify. There's a lot related to handling complaints by honest and dishonest voters. So there are a lot of things to do. And the last one I wanted to mention, which is not from a research perspective, but from talking to decision makers, that I think we currently have so many different voting schemes that all have their advantages and disadvantages that we kind of need a decision support system that allows decision makers to make better decisions to see which of these schemes fits best to the context.